The Sony A1 Mark II is all set to go on November 19th. We have the rumored specs, and well, they're kind of disappointing. So quickly, what is the Sony A1 and why should it matter for someone like me who, while I'm not a sports shooter and I would probably never spend that much for a mirrorless camera, and maybe you're in the same boat that with the price tag, which we'll go into in a bit, it's out of most people's price range. Well, the Sony A1 is Sony's flagship mirrorless camera. So generally speaking, it's supposed to be the best of the best. And since it's the flagship, it gives us an inside track on where Sony's technology is and allows us to kind of project in the future what maybe will be coming to cheaper cameras. So for someone who will not shoot with the A1, it is still rather important. So let's go ahead and go over these rumored specs. I do trust this. This is coming from Sony Alpha Rumors. He's been very spot on over the last year-ish. I know he was kind of hit or miss for a long time, but it seems like the closer that a product is to being released, he has more and more information. He can really nail down those sources. So I do believe that these specs are probably accurate for the most part. So the A1 Mark II will have pretty much an identical body to the A9 Mark III, which from all accounts I've heard is a great, comfortable body to fit in the hand. And the other thing that's super cool is it's going to have that same articulating flip screen, which not only flips up, but also flips to the side, which I think is the best of both worlds and the best implementation of a flip screen that I've personally seen. I'm shooting right now on the Nikon Z8 along with the Sony ZV-E1. We'll see if we're able to actually mix the colors right or if I'll even use this camera shot. And I really wish the Z8 had a flip screen, but I also do enjoy the fact that it's able to flip down and give you that really straight on shot. So I think it's great for behind the camera work, but I do have to use an external monitor if I want to use it for talking head videos, kind of like this one. Jumping back to the specs, the A1 will have the same 50 megapixel or 50.1 megapixel stacked sensor of the original. Now to me, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It was already a very fast sensor when it comes to stacked sensors. It's still like at the very top pretty much. I think the R5 Mark II maybe kind of starts to match it in speed, but not quite. The Z8 and the Z9 also have a very fast sensor, but I don't know if it's quite as fast as the Sony A1. It will also have the PreCapture feature, which is something that was also in the A9 Mark III. If that setting is turned on, it essentially allows your camera to almost be taking pictures automatically for about a half a second to I think a second and a half is generally speaking where they range. Not sure what it is on the A9 Mark III. And that way, if you're slightly off or you maybe missed the shot a bit, it's able to go back and capture it for you. It is a really cool feature, and I'm glad that it's finally coming to the Sony A1. They are claiming that this will have 8 stops of in-body stabilization. The Sony A1 right now, the current one, has 5.5 stops. But to me, from what I've seen out of pretty much every camera company, doesn't necessarily matter the number of stops, it's the implementation. I know Canon markets as 8 stops as well, and I've heard it's really good, but it also gives you that warbly type thing that goes on in the corners if you happen to be walking with it and maybe trying to film yourself. So that's a problem. Lumix usually doesn't advertise as 8, I don't believe, but most people say that Lumix has like the best image stabilization out of any camera company at this point. So I do not really care what the amount of actual stops are. What I do care is how it is implemented. And I think that recently Sony has really started to step it up, especially when it comes to something like their active stabilization that crops in. It's a really cool feature. It's something that is in the Sony ZV-E1. And I really do think that digital stabilization in that way, especially if you're like walking with the camera, is absolutely the best. So moving on to one of the more disappointing specs is that it's going to have the same 30 frames per second of the original A1. Now we're not sure of the bit depth of the images, so maybe they've raised that up, which would be a plus for sure. And it's still very fast for a 50 megapixel sensor to have something shooting at 30 frames per second is very fast. It was fast on the A1, it's fast now. But when you start to compare it to the market, that's when it starts to look very underwhelming. The Canon R5 Mark II was just recently announced. are actually just recently released, and it is a $4,300 camera, and it shoots 30 frames per second. And well, this is going to be somewhere around a $6,500 camera. Price is leaked for euros, which is $74.99, and is a bit more expensive than the $72.99 of the original. That being said, the dollar has gained on the euro, and I think it's somewhere around 15% more than what it was worth back in 2001. So I do not think they're going to be going over the $6,500 USD price tag. Still, to me, it's not a good look to have your $6,500-ish flagship camera just matching the $4,300 Canon camera. This is also 4 years later. It came out in January of 2001. We're close to the end of 2004, so it's been almost 4 years between releases. How could it not be faster at this point? What are you not putting in it for processing power to be able to push it a little bit further? Which brings us to even more disappointing news, and that's going to be that it's going to stay at 8K 30. Now, most people aren't even going to shoot in 8K, but if you're going to buy a camera like this, maybe you're interested in it. And you have now the Nikon Z8, which shoots 8K 60, as well as the Canon R5 that shoots 8K 60, and they shoot 8K 60 in RAW or up to RAW, and that is pretty crazy impressive that they're able to do that. And the Canon's a $4,300 camera. The Nikon Z8 is, I think, $38.99 MSRP, but it shoots down to like $34.99 at this point because it's a little bit older. So you have cameras that are coming in thousands of dollars less that are able to shoot at 8K 60, and you're still pushing out 8K 30 4 years later. To me, that's just not a good look, and I really doubt that they're going to be bringing RAW support. I wish that they would, not because necessarily everybody needs RAW and those file sizes are crazy, but the fact that it gives people the option to shoot that, it just shows where technology is and what's pushing things forward and, well, what's not. And if this is Sony's flagship offering basically the same repackaged stuff from 2001, that's not a good sign for Sony looking forward, in my opinion. Now, this will be bringing over the same AI chip that is in the Sony ZV-1 and the A9 Mark III, and that's great. It's going to be really good for autofocusing, and it will have a lot of different capabilities, but that's nothing that we haven't seen before, seen earlier in a cheaper model, and it's just not pushing anything further. I think it's basically matching the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon R1 when it comes to autofocusing capabilities. There's blow for blows that goes back and forth, but they're very comparable. But again, it's nothing spectacular. It's nothing above and beyond what we've already seen out of Sony. Now, one rumored improvement that is a good thing is this is supposed to have capabilities with CF Express Type A version 4, which are much faster cards. The problem is that those cards are very expensive because pretty much only Sony uses those, where everything else pretty much uses CF Express Type B, which are much cheaper and generally speaking faster. So I would like a little bit chunkier of a camera and put 2 CF Express Type B cards in it if it was me personally, but Sony does their own thing, so I'm sure it will have that dual CF Express with SD card type thing. It's a good thing, but it's not necessarily a spectacular thing. And I think that's the point and the overall thought process that I have. This thing is 4 years down the road. It's supposed to be your flagship. It's going to be premium dollar. And it makes me think, what are you doing over the last 4 years that you cannot push the industry forward at all? I can see this being a somewhat slightly mid-gen type upgrade. They have some of those things that are evolutionary and not revolutionary, but generally speaking, those come out within like 2 to 2.5 years later. This is almost 4 years later. It looks a lot more like a cash grab rather than a flagship, because essentially from what we're hearing, all these parts are in the A9 Mark III or the A1. So they're just grabbing things that they already have and putting it together and saying, hey, we got a new flagship, pay premium top dollar for it. But those are just my thoughts. Drop in the comment section below and give me some of yours. If you've liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Until next time, peace.